What if there is someone who can help you with your investments to know all your options, where designing a legacy doesn't have to be scary? Welcome this morning to the Design Your Legacy podcast. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Jim Whitesides. He is a registered securities representative with Great Point Capital. Welcome, Jim.
Good morning, Angelina.
Thank you so much for joining. And you're joining today, is it from the St. Louis area or where about in the United States?
Yes, good morning. I'm glad to join with you. Yes, I'm in Hillsborough, Missouri, which is just outside of St. Louis.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, in our icebreaker conversation a couple of months back, I got to learn about Delaware Statutory Trusts for the first time. And as somebody who has worked in commercial real estate in the past, I had never heard of them. And I thought it was so fascinating in connection and relationship with 1031 exchanges. So I thought maybe we could start here. So, what is a DST and what are some of the characteristics?
Right. It's a very good question. And, a lot of people in the real estate business, even tax professionals, don't have a lot of familiarity with DSTs. They're relatively new. DST stands for Delaware Statutory Trust. It is a private placement security. It is, you can think of it kind of like a stock, but it doesn't trade on an exchange. They're sold directly to investors. And sometimes a comparison helps explain. So when you buy 100 shares of a stock, you're buying a fractional ownership in the company. Whereas with a DST, the investor is buying a fractional ownership in the underlying real estate that the DST owns. And so it is a real estate investment. But since it is actual ownership of the underlying real estate, it is 1031 exchange eligible. And maybe just a quick point on what a 1031 exchange is. When an investor owns a piece of commercial property and it appreciates and they sell that property, if they do nothing, they owe taxes on the gains. But a 1031 is the IRS code that allows those gains to be deferred by the investor when they follow certain rules to sell property A and buy a replacement property B. And so if you follow the rules, you can defer those gains into the new property. And so a DST is one way of accomplishing that 1031 exchange. The most obvious way would be, for example, if someone owned an apartment building and they sold it and they wanted to buy a self-storage facility and the apartment building had appreciated, well, one could sell the apartment building and go out and buy a self-storage facility. But that may not always be possible or desirable for a number of reasons. So a DST can be used as that replacement property in a 1031 exchange.
That's wonderful. Thank you for the background and the context. So it is a trust. So there would be a trustee and then the beneficial owner.
Correct. Generally, a trust has two types of participants. As you said, the trustee and then the beneficial owners. And so the investors in a DST are the beneficial owners. That is
Yes.
correct.
Yeah. Again, I had never heard of this, and I think, and we're going to talk about some of the upside in a moment regarding the benefits, because again, when you were explaining it to me the first time around, I said, "Why is no one talking about this?" Or why haven't I heard this before? I would have thought that if it is a financial vehicle that someone can invest in, and they don't have to necessarily worry about, the litigation that comes with owning commercial property or some of the other headaches that could come up. Again, I thought, well, this is fantastic. Yeah. And one of the points I made to you in our preamble before I started recording is a lot of times when somebody comes into money, whether it's an inheritance or they've done well with cryptocurrencies or a number of other reasons in today's landscape, they'd like to know their options and their choices. And sometimes, unless there's a random conversation, they don't know that different things exist that can make their life easier. And they think they might only have three options.
Very good point. And a couple of those things that I'll mention as well that are benefits of it. You touched on a couple of them with DSTs. Is I'll use my example before. If an investor owns an apartment building, that may be a substantial portion of the investor's personal wealth. So it's very concentrated in one asset. And they may also personally be liable for the debt associated with that apartment building. And not only that, on a day-to-day basis, they have to take care of the property. They pick up trash, or they rent apartments, or what have you, whatever their involvement is. So among the reasons why investors might sell their real estate is because they may want to have less of the day-to-day responsibility. Well, with the DSTs, these are professionally managed. They're issued by large companies that have a long track record of managing properties. So they purchase properties, they put the debt in place, they put the management team in place. So an investor can be much more diversified. There might be one, or there might be 50 properties in the DST. So the investor is much more diversified. The debt on a DST is non-recourse to the investor. So unlike your apartment building, where if something were to happen, you would not only have your equity at risk, but you would also be on the hook for the debt. With a DST, all the debt is non-recourse. And the investor has, frankly, access to much higher quality of real estate. So if I owned an apartment building and I sold it, I could diversify into 3 or 4 or 5 different DSTs that are in different sectors. I'm more diversified. But when I invest along with many others, we have access to much higher quality of real estate than we would on our own.
That's wonderful. Thank you for speaking into that. And if I don't know if I'm able to put you on the spot for a moment, but what is your story with learning about DSTs? You had storage units, and then one day somebody came to you and they said, Jim, have you heard about DSTs?
Right. Well, the way it worked out is that yes, I had a self-storage business. I had a number of properties here on the St. Louis area.
As a real estate investor,
Pardon me?
as a real estate investor,
Right, right. Well, and as an operator too, I was involved day to day. I did all the things that my managers did. So I was a hands-on. It was a business. It wasn't a passive investment. And so I had decided, for a variety of reasons, I would sell, and I would do a 1031 exchange. My intention was to then acquire other rental properties that could build on what I knew, but maybe give me some, something new to learn, but less day-to-day requirements, so that I could spend more time with my kids before they trot off to college, And so I had a deal for my storage business. I started looking for replacement properties. I was assuming I was going to buy individual properties. I started to identify them, but the deal for my business fell through. And second time I had an offer on my business, I started looking for replacement properties, and that deal fell through also, which is one of the problems with doing a 1031 exchange that includes physical real estate. So the third time around, the deal went through on my business. You have 45 days to identify a replacement property after you sell a property. And I had only put to work about 25% of the money that I needed to. So I was very concerned. Someone introduced me to the DST concept. It worked out extremely well for me. And so that's what I did. And over time, I decided it was so much better for me than owning the individual buildings that I sold my buildings. I went back to Great Point Capital and said, I know a lot of people in self-storage and in other types of sectors too that don't know all their options. That I think that they would be willing to transact, or would be willing to take steps to improve, what they want, their quality of life and so forth, if they knew their options for what they can do when they sell. And so that's what I do. We do a number of different things as well, but that's one of the primary things we do, is we help business owners or property owners know all their options and find the right exit strategy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I just wanted you for a moment to speak into your own story, because it was real for you, and you left the world that was familiar to you because you felt that DSTs were a better option, a better investment, a better, something to give your time to day to day. That it was something that it was like an open door, that you even said, wow, this makes sense. I want to become a part of this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that gives people great comfort, knowing that I've been in their shoes, knowing that I've lived through some of the complexities of doing a 1031 exchange, and I can describe in really practical terms why this is an option. It's not for everyone, but this is an option to really become aware of, to see if it is the right one for you.
Well, I think this conversation is so relevant because when there is a commercial real estate investor and they have a number of properties, like we've talked about prior to, either that can be one of the greatest lifestyle changes for them that can free up their time, allow them to spend more time with family, do what it is that they love. Or on the flip side, it could be something that can crush them in the pressure. And again, this is not often talked about, whether it is the litigation or just having the stress of wearing 8 different hats in order to make something work. And if somebody goes down to the local coffee shop, this might not be the conversation that can be easily relatable to of, yeah, I've got 8 different storage units, Angelina. Let me tell you all the stress I go through every single day. I mean,
Right.
it's like that. Either the circle of people know it around them and they can be transparent, or it's something, unless somebody has walked a mile in those shoes, that they can truly understand how valuable it is to have choices compared to just thinking, I got to buy and sell and buy and sell or buy and hold. And it's, yeah.
And I'll add one thing to that, and it's particularly relevant today. As we all know, real estate values have gone up a lot in recent years. So it might be the sort of thing where someone would like to sell their apartment building or their storage facility or whatever it is, but they don't really want to turn around in today's world and go out and worry about overpaying for real estate or having to take out loans at interest rates that are higher than they think they'll have to in the future. And so DSTs can also be a very worthwhile kind of a parking place. Even for someone who's a professional investor who has lots of real estate, this might not be the right time for them to, it might be the right time to sell a specific property, but it may not be the time that they want to buy something. So a DST can also be a parking spot because you can do a 1031 exchange multiple times. If I were to sell my, if I sold my self-storage business in 2017, I'm now, up to my eyeballs in DSTs, but I have still maintained the option, if I chose to when those DSTs liquidate, to go back into anything else. So I preserve the flexibility, every step of the way. It doesn't limit what someone can do. And that's really relevant today because I think that people don't want to feel pressured into doing something because they have a time limit, or they have a time crunch, or they have too many other things going on to look for the type of replacement property that they want to find, or there aren't enough properties listed, as is the case right now. There are just fewer and fewer properties listed because there's uncertainty about what the value is, and there are fewer lenders that are willing to loan on commercial properties, and they'll loan a lot less than they used to. So DSTs eliminates all of those concerns.
Yes, it's fascinating because you had brought up again the idea of a 1031, and there's a window of time, and I'm not sure if I think it's like 45 days to identify and then 180 days to complete the transaction, which can seem like a long time. But if you can't get an offer accepted or you can't find that property, so oftentimes they talk about how there's more money than inventory, more money on the sidelines than there is product to invest in, good product.
Very true. It's very true.
Yes. So what would you have to share about this idea that some investors talk about regarding the swap until you drop expression?
Right. Well, that's a good segue from a comment I made a moment ago, that when someone sells a piece of commercial real estate, your options are: one, pay your taxes and move on; two, find a replacement piece of real estate that you can purchase; or three, do a 1031 buy replacement property, do a 1031 exchange, or you can do a 1031 exchange with a DST. And those options exist multiple times. So you can do them. Swap until you drop just means you can do a 1031 exchange into a DST, and that one goes full cycle. You then do a 1031 exchange into a laundromat. Then you keep that as long as you want. You can do another 1031 exchange into a DST again. And so the gains in each of those steps is deferred, and you can do those indefinitely. So that's what they refer to as swap until you drop. And basically, you can do that up until the point that the investor passes away. And at that point, the assets can be passed along to an heir at then market value. So all the gains can be erased. All the tax obligations can be erased And so that's among the reasons why people like doing 1031 exchanges, because it's a very efficient way of avoiding taxes that are necessary by the heirs, that sort of thing, and taxes by the original investor. There's one type of other exchange that that folks might have heard of. It's called a 721 exchange, and that is, for example, when I sold my storage business, it was purchased by a national company, a public company, and they paid me cash, but they offered to pay me shares in their company instead. And that would be considered a 721 exchange or an UPREIT. So it would be a tax-free exchange as well, but you only get to do that one time. So if I did the 721 exchange and accepted their shares, that would be not be a taxable event. But when I sold those shares, I would have only the option to pay the taxes. That would be the taxable event, and I wouldn't have the swap until you drop option. So an UPREIT or a 721 is not a bad option. It's just one that people need to be aware of. It does limit your options down the line.
Yes, fascinating. Because again, this is not that common knowledge that's out there. And I think when somebody gets to design their legacy, whether again it's through an inheritance or that they have done well, I think it's today about 2/3 of today's affluent are self-made. So if they're not having these conversations at their kitchen table growing up, how do they find out about it if not for a good podcast?
Right. And oftentimes if part of one's legacy for one's children is to pass a certain amount of wealth, it oftentimes is the wealth. It's not the properties that one wants to pass along. I had no desire to pass along self-storage facilities to my kids, and they can say, oh, someday all these doors are yours. That really wouldn't be their interest. But the fruits of the hard work is what I would hope to pass along to them in terms of financially. Anyways, that's not the whole story, but so this is a way of kind of solving a little bit of an estate planning issue as well. If someone has 3 children and one property or one business, then it can be tricky when the day ultimately comes. So.
And it's so interesting because I think one of the things that we had talked about before is somebody could enter a DST and it could be for an amount of time. And correct me if I'm because I don't remember exactly the details, whether it's like 3 years or 5 years or 7 years.
Yes.
And then it's sold, and then somebody can. I just want
Yeah.
to emphasize that point because if somebody can go in and it's like a 3-year commitment and then or a 5-year commitment and then they're in and they're out and then they know that it's because sometimes one of the things they talk about with investors, an investor could be cash poor but asset rich.
Exactly true. And so those are some aspects of DSTs that I think that that's all part of the learning process, right? The issuer of a DST, by the time that we show a particular investment opportunity to a client, the DST issuer has acquired the properties, put the debt in place. They have done all their pro formas. They have the management team in place. They went through all the regulators in terms of the due diligence there. They went through the due diligence at Great Point Capital. It's all of that has taken place ahead of time. So, some of the concerns about having to do those things are really have already been addressed. Yeah.
So who would be the ideal candidate? Who would this appeal to, number one? And number two, what else is important to know?
Okay, good question. I think that it's important to point out that the DSTs are, since they're private placement security, there are greater requirements placed on the issuer than there are in some cases than regular securities. So the investors have to be accredited investors, so they have to be relatively sophisticated. Meaning at least a net worth of at least $1 million and an income of at least 200,000 for the last 3 years. There has to be a fair amount of due diligence done between myself and an investor to make sure that we understand their risk tolerance and their goals and their objectives and that sort of thing. And all that has to be documented. So those sorts of things have to take place. The couple of things I'll point out too that what's important to know. I mentioned that you can do a DST in place of physical real estate in a 1031 exchange. Well, 1031 exchange has to be, in order for the IRS to accept and approve a 1031 exchange, the money from the sold property cannot touch the investor's hands. So there has to be what they call a qualified intermediary who accepts the funds from the sale property, holds them. They're the one who identifies, the investor identifies the replacement property with. So they hold the funds on your behalf, and then they issue those funds once your replacement property is time to close on it and you purchase it. So the qualified intermediary is something that we can help with too. It's a very standard thing, but it's important for an investor to know they can't take constructive receipt of their proceeds of their sale property. So if you sell a property, you collect the money, the 1031 option is no longer an option. So there's that. And then the qualified intermediary will help the investor complete the necessary paperwork. And as you mentioned earlier, you have 45 days from the time you sell a property to identify the replacement properties. And then you have 180 days to actually close and purchase the properties you identify with the qualified intermediary. And there are some other detailed rules that the qualified intermediary has to follow too. You can only identify so many properties of so much value. The replacement property has to be at least as much dollar value, as the property you sold. The replacement property has to have at least as much debt as the property you sold. So those are some details that of course I work with clients on, and the qualified intermediary makes sure that the investor meets those requirements as well, and so they can preserve their tax deferral possibilities.
Yes. So before I move on to the legacy portion, what is it that you like the best about DSTs?
I like the fact that like personally as an investor, I'm very diversified. If you have X amount of dollars that you need to invest, I have about 7 or 8 different DSTs. And this gets back to a question you asked earlier, and I lost my train of thought and didn't give you the answer to. You mentioned 3 or 5 years. So when DSTs are issued, all the property is in place. The issuer has a plan. Now they set an intention, right, for the investment. Their plan is they're going to acquire these assets, they're going to improve the value, they're going to raise rents, and their plan is to sell it in 3 years or 5 years. And so when an investor goes in, they know what the intention is of the issuer. So the hold period is usually anywhere from 3 to 5 years. It could be a little longer, but that's usually what happens. And they're not liquid, generally speaking, during that time. So investors need to think of them as a pretty illiquid investment. There are exceptions, and there are liquidity provisions in a lot of them, but they need to be thought of as being an illiquid investment. And that's one of the negatives, if you will. Say, well, these things sound terrific. Well, what's the downside? Well, they are relatively illiquid, and the investor doesn't have control. So if you're someone who really needs to have control over the day-to-day, I can select between any sectors that I think are useful. So again, if I have X dollars to invest, and I put it in 6 different DSTs, or let's use 5 to make the math simple, 5 different DSTs, then they're all 20% of my total. Well, their 3 to 5 year period is going to come up at a different point in time. So my subsequent decisions are only on 20% of my total. So I can then make the subsequent decisions on a smaller piece of my total pie, if you will. So I'm able to not only diversify and lower my risk, but I'm able to make decisions that keep me current with either current trends, or as my view of what my needs are or what the market is. I can make those adjustments as you go. It's not a permanent long-term investment, and it doesn't give you less flexibility. So, and I have nothing to do on the day-to-day. So all those things fit for me. And I think that for a lot of people, they really fit it as well.
Yes. Well, I think if you can take something off of someone's plate, it frees them up. And one of the things people love, in addition to protecting their survival, is freedom. If they can feel like they have that time freedom, that's priceless. Yes. So since this is a legacy podcast, will DSTs be your legacy? Or how do you define this word when you think about it personally in reflection?
Yeah, that's it's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked. Um, I applaud you for asking that question. I applaud you for that being your business to raise kind of people's awareness, and so they can consider that, because I just as you've said before, sometimes this isn't the sort of thing that a particular client of yours might have it in mind, but they need someone to help organize the thoughts and so forth. And so I think that's what makes you very successful, is you do a nice job with that. So I got to compliment you on that, first of all. Um, as for me personally, uh, you know, what does legacy mean? It's a really, I would like to think about it a little bit more in terms of what my responsibilities might be more broadly. I think that we do have some responsibility to all human beings. And that's probably the part that I need to, that I could use some help with, perhaps, Angelina. But on a personal level, in terms of not just to all humans, but on a personal level, I'll say that uh, I've had a meditation practice for about the last 15 years, and it's been very important. It's been a very important part of my personal growth. And the reason I mention that is because, as I'm sure you're well aware, so one of the common ideas of any of those Eastern sorts of traditions is to focus more on the present moment. And a way of doing that is to consciously uh, not try to live in the future, worry about the future, or regret the past.
But to
And
be in
so
the
there
present
are obviously
moment.
there are practical realities that we have to plan for the future, and the thought process of our legacy is a very worthwhile and necessary thing. But for me personally, I think that my legacy is I think in terms of my responsibility to myself and to those closest to me, my children, my significant other, my friends. And I would like to think that my legacy to them would be an example of someone who tried to live in the moment and tried to be as authentic as I can, to accept my reality, to forgive myself when necessary, and to continue to grow and progress as a person. And my hope would be that I can take the next step of passing that along as kind of my, I guess my legacy or my responsibility, my children and those closest to me, is to assist them and support them in accepting that they're on their own journey, and it's not my journey. It's not going to go the way I want it to, but I'm here to support them, and they need to accept their strengths and their shortcomings. And like I said, for myself, they need to offer forgiveness when they need to, or ask for forgiveness rather, and to continue to grow. And so I just personally feel like that's a really important thing to me, and that's the sort of thing that I would hope to, an example I'd hope to be for my kids, for my significant other, for my friends, that sort of thing. And so it has kind of a ripple effect going forward. That's what I think of when I think of legacy, as kind of a personal responsibility sort of thing for the people in my life.
I think that's wonderful. And I appreciate that you spoke into meditation. I think that the mindfulness to be in the present moment, to be very aware, to be very conscientious, is a best practice, because it opens up that you are in the here and now, and it's asking, like, what is it that you notice, and notice what it is you notice in the details of, not just skipping over or going through the motions. Whether, sometimes subconsciously we know how to drive to the store and back, or to the library and back, and yet what is it to be fully aware, to notice the trees, to notice the people in the car, to notice all of it, because that is the richness of life.
Right. And exactly. And it's about recognizing what opportunities. If you're not paying attention to your drive to the store, there may have been someone on the side of the road who needed help. You didn't notice it, or you didn't see them, or what have you. But I totally agree with you. That level of awareness, and that level of awareness kind of requires us not to be too much in the future or too much in the past. I mean, again, there are practical realities, but it's a struggle. It's a lifelong journey, right?
Well, I think it's a lifelong commitment to want to be consciously in the present moment than to check out. Some people are just like waiting to escape with every distraction. So to choose to want to step into the present moment, I think says a lot about your character. So I'm just curious before I go on to the next question of, how did you learn about meditation? Was there someone in the Navy that influenced you, or was there someone in the business world?
You know, I had a friend who I have a friend who's from Sri Lanka, and we used to always have a lot of very deep, meaningful conversations. And I asked him about his thought process and what brought him to where he was. And meditation had been a practice of his for many, many decades. And so uh, he started to introduce me to the idea. And my first interaction, honestly, was a bit of a ready, fire, aim sort of thing. There was a 10-day silent meditation retreat that I attended. I had never meditated before. I'd never done anything, and there was a Vipassana meditation center near Chicago, and so it was a 10-day experience where you don't talk to anyone, there's no phone, there's no computer, there's no exercise. It's a 10 days. And so it's a remarkable thing. I've done it 7 or 8 times now, and it's the exact same. It's the exact same process. It's the exact same menu. It's the exact same everything every time, but it's completely different because you're different. I'm different, right?
Well,
So I come away from it with a very different takeaway every time. It's been really wonderful.
I think it nourishes your psyche and your soul, your spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so
Agree.
glad that you have the courage to speak into that. So you're not
Yeah.
just another real estate investor, right?
No, I think the people that know me best would say no, they're not quite down the middle of middle of the fairway. That's right. Yeah.
So, what would you say are the top three values that you get to honor today through your best practices and work and choices?
Okay. And I love the way you do a very nice job of trying to boil things down to something very meaningful, the nuggets, and I like that. I would say the answer to that question um, would be the first one. Uh, we talked a little bit about with relation to meditation, but I think it's also equally applicable to real estate, and it also relates to the tattoo that I have because my kids wanted to get one that relates to this as well, and so I joined them in that, and that is acceptance and accepting the reality that exists, accepting our own personal reality, our shortcomings, our strengths. So acceptance would be the first one. Honesty would be the second, and making that a part of our every moment, part of our conscious decision every moment. And then lastly would be selflessness, to kind of make sure that we realize it's not all about us, that we need to make an effort to make the rising tide lift all ships, not just what serves us best. So those would be my three virtues that I would
Oh, I think those
emphasize.
are fantastic values. Thank you. Thank you for speaking into them. So, one of my final questions is, let's say that you get to set aside a weekend or two for the next 6 or 12 months and create a hardcover coffee table book for your next generations, whether it's 3 or 5 generations out. What would be in it? What images or content? What might be in it?
Um, that's another good question, and I might choose to do it differently than I have. I don't have such a coffee table book, but some years ago I did start a journal, if you will, that was intended to it was intended for my kids, and it was intended to be, without being specific about um, dates or anything like that. It was just my truth, as I saw it, and truth that I felt was ongoing because we live in a very changing world. So it would be nice to have a place where it could be a repository for unchanging truth. I think, as I saw it, anyways, to them. So, you know, I in the book there are articles, or there might be a poem, or there might be anything, might be my musings, might be just what I'm going through from a critical juncture of my life, so that my kids better know, who I am or who I was, what my thought processes were, just to make it kind of real and to pass along to them what I feel was unchanging truth. So every entry in there, I kind of consciously, I don't know why I thought this was important, but I did. I didn't want to put a date on any of the entries because I thought, well, if it's an unchanging truth, it doesn't matter when. So that's what I have. So my intention was to emphasize things like compassion, honesty, personal responsibility, and those sorts of things that I really think it's hard to argue are not always going to be something that humans need to embody.
I think there's a timelessness to it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. That was the intention, anyways.
I think it's wonderful, the thoughtfulness. I didn't know that before this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting book. I go back and I read it sometimes between, times I put an entry in and I'm kind of intrigued by things that I wrote in there too.
Well, I think sometimes there are downloads from the universe, from the ether, that we're like, wow, yeah, that resonate with our soul, and we might ask, well, where did that come from? But still,
Right.
it's like that it came, and you wrote it down, and that's what matters, because you
Yeah.
are present that moment to receive it.
Agreed. Well put.
So, any closing thoughts, or what's a great website if a listener or viewer would like to learn more about DSTs now that you've inspired them by your legacy example?
Right. Well, let's see. My partners and I do a variety of things in commercial real estate. If it's securities related, if there's securitized real estate involved, then it's through Great Point Capital. Um, and Googling Great Point Capital is the place to start. But I will say that for regulatory reasons, there aren't a lot of specifics about investments, DST investments on the website, because you just have to limit what you put out there in a written format. That's just the reality of today's world, risk management, right?
Well, and I
Um,
think you mentioned it's often situation and investor specific.
Absolutely. And anything we say that creates expectations can create the expectations that are inappropriate or what have you. So Great Point Capital is one can Google for anything we do in real estate that is not securitized, like raising equity for developers or introducing joint venture partners or any one of a variety of things that we'll do on the physical real estate side that does not have to do with securities. We do through Git Realty Services, and that is GITT Realty Services LLC.com. So it's a long one, but Git Realty Services LLC.com, and that just tells you a little bit about it. Gives a profile of myself and my partners, and it's a good, small but very good team. And I would say that we specialize in helping people that starting where I was. I was kind of a ground zero when I got introduced to DSTs, and we're patient. We'll help identify all the options for you, and we'd be glad to help if we can. And really, I'm grateful to you, Angelina, for having me on today. Thank you very much. You're a wonderful interviewer, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, thank you. I just wanted to also share that I've been pleasantly surprised, because sometimes we can see someone on the outside by their title, by their suit. I made that joke of, oh, you're not just another real estate investor, because there's still like a human being behind there. And I think that is has been a lovely opportunity to be able to uncover that and to bring it forward to inspire others. I think I shared with you that there on YouTube, I think about 80% of the viewers are under age 40. And so just as about 2/3 of today's affluent are self-made, there's a number of young people out there that are searching for new ways of investing and new ways of doing things, and they're looking for answers that maybe they can't find in public or private school or through traditional means. And so it's that authentic conversation that can lift them up, just like you had the friend from Sri Lanka that inspired you.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. I also just wanted to acknowledge your values of acceptance, honesty, selflessness, and compassion. I think those are beautiful and quite lovely. And so, yeah. So I'm just going to read out the closing paragraph real quick. Okay. So, in closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder of Legacy Planning, a boutique advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, but international in those I consult. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person to find, develop, and execute their legacy. And I continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners and viewers, there can never be enough education or influence in the moat or moot around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content on this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your emotional and intellectual curiosity. So if you're checking us out on Apple Podcasts, please remember to rate and review. Or if you're checking us out on YouTube, please remember to comment, like, subscribe, share with your friends and family. Thank you so much for joining us once again this week. And thank you to Jim for speaking into your legacy.